Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad everybody could attend. Donna, the entire Atlantic Data team, I sincerely appreciate you guys setting this up. So welcome, everybody. Before I kick it over to Chris, I'm going to do kind of a quick overview of NCC Group. I'm going to keep this under 2 minutes, hopefully, if not less. But my name is Tom Higgins. I am the head of channel sales here in North America for NCC Group. I thought it best to kind of give an overview of who we are. I realize not a lot of you know our name, or at least you may not know that you know our name. So NCC Group is one of the largest pure play cybersecurity consulting companies in the world. And by pure play, I mean that we don't sell hardware or software. We only do security consulting. While our background and our lifeblood is really kind of born around application assessments, for which we perform thousands every year, we do everything from simple vulnerability assessments and penetration testing on up to very technical security assessments for some of the most largest and the most security focused companies in the world, like Apple, Facebook, Microsoft. So we really compete with some of the smaller boutique firms, such as like MWR or Red Balloon, as well as some of the more well-known players like Rapid7 or the Big Four. Especially in the Big Four's case around things like the risk management and governance practice. So the niche that we're in is really kind of a sweet spot because we can be as technical and provide the personal service as some of the smaller boutique shops, and then we can move rapidly and respond quickly to needs. But we can also be really strategic, thoughtful, and operate at a scale really is the same way the Big Four do. It's just a good place to be in because the reality is the Big Fours aren't going out there with the same technical detail that NCC Group does. And at the same time, the smaller companies aren't really competing at the enterprise scale that we are, nor can they scale. So our headquarters is in the UK. Our US offices are really two main ones, which would be New York and San Francisco. And then we have a number of smaller regional offices out of Boston, Atlanta, Austin, Chicago. We have like 32 of them around the world. In North America today, in North America today, we really are the de facto standard for all things related to security services. Companies like the aforementioned Google, Facebook, Amazon, they actually recommend their own clients to us. So we are the number one provider of PCI related services around Europe, and we're really rapidly expanding that throughout North America. And we've really kind of grown through both acquisition and then holistically through our own growth methods. We have several SOCs around the world. We just integrated Accumuli and Random Storm into our repertoire. And our most recent acquisition is a company which you've probably all heard of, Fox IT, which really expands our visibility into incidents and breaches, and it also greatly expands our ability to offer incident response. So over the past few years, we've also added a little bit more regional coverage. For instance, here in Boston, we added a company called Virtual Security Research. Some of you may have worked with them in the past. And then we've also added a company called PSC to really kind of greatly expand our footprint around PCI and QSA. So what separates us apart from everybody else? Early on, the principals in our company saw the value of having top minds work together. So really our mantra is to recruit those top minds and retain them, and then from them develop a strategy around best practices. And then through research and constant improvement, we're really developing the most secure and up-to-date methodology. So the testing methodology is very thorough. We think that really kind of shows in the completeness of our deliverables. And we have sample reports that we can send out to the team or they can get to you for kind of proof of that. So with our background of heavy engineering and with the acquisition of some of those key companies, our depth is now really extensive. We offer anything from, standard security services such as pen testing, risk assessments, application testing, compliance, audits, attestations, to even some of the more niche services like crypto consulting, bug bounty programs. We specialize in things like SCADA system security, and we have an extremely extensive hardware assessment practice. So I mentioned earlier how we're one of the largest pure play cybersecurity consulting companies. And again, that means we don't carry hardware or software. We do, however, partner with a number of security product and services companies like Atlantic Data. In the course of our assessments, we oftentimes find clients that need remediation to fill some of the gaps in their security program. So we end up passing a lot of those clients that need remediation to Atlantic Data to work with those end clients for anything from analysis, recommending solutions, deployment, and even the operationalization, tough word, of some of those critical components into their organization. So what sets apart Atlantic Data is really their depth and their technical knowledge around the security components that they carry, perimeter, endpoint, cloud. We really do send a lot of clients their way. So with that overview of NCC Group, I want to introduce a few people. On the line, we have Jennifer Hoffman, who is on the sales side here in the Northeast US. We also have Justin Orchid, who is a resident RMG sales specialist. And then presenting today is going to be Chris Gaida, a Director of Risk Management and Governance. And on that final note, Chris, stage is all yours.
Thanks, Tom. So yeah, when I received the topic here, when we're talking about things like benchmarking and scaling your organizations, in order to create the content here, I immediately thought of one of the service lines that we offer, that I'll go to in more detail. But I'd like to share some of the data and some of the trends that we're learning as part of that assessment, which I hope will be very helpful for each of your organizations. So to preface that, maybe we step back 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we were hearing things like, well, we called it information security instead of cybersecurity. And, the message, especially from a CISO standpoint, was, the board of directors, the CEO, they have no idea what information security is. They need to be educated. They're very much in the dark. Fast forward, we look at some of the stats that we're seeing even, as current as last year. The board, the CEO, the executive leadership teams are becoming more and more savvy. How can they not, right? With all of the headlines that we're seeing today. But, we're hearing now that 52% of the board says that they are confident in understanding the risks to their organization. Interesting data point there. What we're finding is that, yes, they are becoming more and more comfortable with some of the risks that we're seeing out there. However, the message that's being provided to the CEO, the board, maybe is not the full message. So if we look at the NACD, one of the other items that they've provided to help support this is that cybersecurity threats are now are part of the top 5 lists that we're seeing as far as what could have the greatest impact on organizations in the next 12 months. So, if we look back 10 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. We would have never seen things like cybersecurity. So again, things are progressing, we're getting better, but how do we continue to push for that? So first thing, the CERT alluded to is called the Cybersecurity Review. It's a very strategic and pointed assessment type that we provide. As part of that, we focus on a couple different things in order to look at an organization's cybersecurity strategy. So for example, you can't protect what you don't know. We've all heard that term. But to add on to that, you can't have an efficient or effective cybersecurity program without understanding your potential threats. Further, you also can't be successful in cybersecurity without supporting the business. So as part of our service line, we take into account those major items when we do our assessment to then figure out what the cybersecurity strategy could be or to provide feedback on what is in place. So let me go into a little bit more detail on the cybersecurity review offering itself. Essentially, it's broken up into 4 pieces, the 4 bubbles that you see here. So we start with context establishment. We want to figure out what has the company been doing, what are they working on, where are they going. We want to figure out what are the major goals, both from a business and security perspective. We want to learn more about the security organization itself, things like that, right? Things that we need to know before we can start moving forward. Then we go into a threat modeling exercise. As part of this, we roll things up into something understandable. So what I mean by that is, you look at NIST 830. If you were to look at things like attack vectors, you'd look at 100 some odd page list of different attack vectors. Instead, we roll everything up so that we can talk simple and everyone can be talking the same language. To do that, we look at critical business applications as opposed to individual assets. So, for example, uh, everyone in the organization knows about critical business application A that makes them millions of dollars, as opposed to the PHP web server on the back end, that Mr. CEO may not be familiar with. Within the threat modeling exercise, we capture data on a bunch of different things: architecture, CIA, threat actors, attack vectors. We do a sensitive data inventory, and a couple different things. From there, we go into the controls assessment. So pick your control framework, NIST, CSF, ISO, CIIQ, whatever you want to have there. But then within that, we collect four major pieces of data. Where does the organization stand today in terms of maturity? Where do they need to be in the future? What is NCC Group's opinion? And then we pull in benchmarking data to figure out where everything stands.
What framework are you marking against? Are you using like NIST, CSF, or what standards?
Yeah, really it's any framework you'd like to use. So NIST, ISO, CIIQ, SANS Top 20,
Okay.
we do any of them.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you had leaned toward or recommended a specific one or not, but okay, thank you.
Well, that's a good point. I think 80% of our cybersecurity reviews use NIST CSF. That seems to be the go-to these days.
Yeah, is that NREL, some of these other ones are pretty decent.
Yeah, I think you can fit the framework based on the organization or the goal. They are a little different, but that could be a debate in itself, right?
Understood.
So as part of the security landscape, we take the first three bubbles, we bake them together and, kind of distill you're here, you need to be there. How do we go about doing that? So as I go through the presentation, I'm going to break down each one of the bubbles in terms of, what we're seeing and some of the trends there. So if we start with context establishment, so that, talking to executives, figuring out business goals, looking at the security organization. If I boil everything up, there's a couple major points that we see. So if we look at the goals misalignment, the cybersecurity strategy, the compliance-driven security, these all kind of tie together, but they are kind of different in their own right. So we're seeing that the security team do not align very well with business goals. They, kind of do their own thing, which kind of ties in the second one. Things are not very strategic. They're more tactical. And, as part of the third one, it seems to be compliance driven. So, all of these major things, I think, hurt some of the security teams that we've reviewed because, well, they don't know what they're protecting. They don't know what they're going towards in terms of a long-term goal. And if you can't, relate how that ties into the business, then, well, you're going to be walking uphill forever, right? The last thing we see here, I think, is very interesting. There's data everywhere. And I'm sure you guys can see that in your own organizations where it doesn't matter where you look, there is some sort of PHI, PII, customer data, security-centric items, the list goes on. There's data everywhere, and it's just getting worse. And the prevalence of that data means that you have to, have controls in place to protect the entire organization, the entire environment, as opposed to focusing on in certain areas. And I think I'll touch on that here in a few slides further. So again, into context establishment, we're seeing some very strategic issues here. First one we have is, budget resourcing. If we look at the average, it's somewhere between 2 and 5% for the security team alone. What we're seeing is that, those numbers are good for maybe an organization that's not, transforming or evolving. But as we all know, most of our organizations are all, adjusting and changing in some way or another. Maybe it's something as simple from going, on-prem into the cloud, or, whatever it is. But the budgets we're seeing are not supported by a transforming organization. We even had a client, I think it was a year ago, where, a major step going from on-prem into the cloud, simple enough, right? But this was not just a small shift, it was a shift of their entire environment, and the cybersecurity team's budget went down. Interesting. Risk management is something that we pick on quite a bit. Yes, there are things out there. People are looking at impact and likelihood, and they're assigning scores, or, low, medium, high, critical, but, it doesn't tie back to a true risk methodology and the benefits that can be gained there. So, we're seeing organizations do okay in vulnerability, maybe impact and likelihood, but often things like looking at threat or applying risk treatment to inherent risk before moving forward are typically not very well. They're not completed very well. Third, there's a lot of security teams still reporting through IT. Yes, this is a common issue where, potential conflict of interest, where, an oversight function is reporting through an operational function. And we do have a lot of conversations with CISOs where, they're saying, yeah, the CIO, he's a great guy. But in, the end of that conversation, we're talking about the lack of budget, things like that. Culture has played a huge role. I mean, we have a huge span here. I'm talking, from conversations with the executive team saying, we don't care about security, all the way through, more passive means where it's, we're trying to do things, but it's just not really supported, right? They're just talking. They're not actually backing up what they're saying. And then lastly, there's quite a few organizations that have not designed their cybersecurity program very well. As a result, they may be hurting in certain areas, like, application development is one that we commonly see, or incident response, areas where, it hasn't been fully vetted or designed. Therefore, those are some of the issues that we're, finding major problems in. So if I jump into threat modeling, this is kind of a funny topic, because a lot of organizations, though they say they've done a risk assessment, have not actually looked at threat. So we like to joke and say, all right, first, what's being attacked? So if we look at the San Francisco office that we have as far as NCC Group, we go down to the bottom floor. There's often a Peruvian food truck there that comes by, and then you go a couple blocks further and we have the Fed. Well, of course, these are very different threat profiles. Depends on what I want, right? What am I going after? If I had high aspirations of getting something from the Fed, clearly I wouldn't do anything with the Peruvian food truck. But if it was lunchtime and I really like Peruvian food, it might be a different story. Then we go into who's attacking, right? We have things that we care less about. We are kitty scripters.
Yeah, I can.
And then we have some, maybe concerns around more serious threats, things like Anonymous, or the People's Liberation Army, the hacking unit that doesn't actually, that shouldn't exist, but it actually exists in this building here. Maybe it's, on our own soil, right? The NSA is coming after us. It depends. So until you actually go through the exercise of analyzing who's attacking you, what is their capability and motivation, we can't focus very well on what we need to be protecting. So threat modeling by the numbers. When we go through that exercise, I mentioned that we look at critical applications, and it's very interesting what organizations actually provide us. Often it's an extensive list, which is a little worrying in itself. So, on average, we see 62 critical applications, which is quite extensive. We're talking in this population, small organizations, large organizations, but when we're talking for large organizations, hundreds of applications, it worries me a little bit that everything is considered critical. If we look at CIA, the scores here look pretty average, which is fine. But again, if we're talking about the list of our critical applications, you would expect that some of these numbers would be a bit higher. Impact on users, again, kind of the same thing. If everything was critical, then we should see the impact to be significantly larger. And all we're learning here is that no one's gone through the exercise, so every application is treated as critical until you have some mechanism to go through and show that it's maybe not as critical as others. From an architecture standpoint, yes, we're seeing a lot of IaaS, PaaS, SaaS. Two pieces here that are interesting as far as SaaS. I was surprised how high the number is because every organization has a cloud environment, or most. So when you're talking about use Amazon, for example, you have a VPC, you have instances, and all the things that you're using as part of that service clearly falls into IaaS. But the SaaS number here is strongly inflated because of all the different services that organizations are also outsourcing to. The conversation there that we start to have with organizations is, okay, IaaS is one thing. Yes, I accept all the responsibilities there, but then, there hasn't been the shift of responsibility or the checking of the SaaS provider in terms of security controls. So, with SaaS, typically your onus is on things like APIs and data. That means that we need to be checking SaaS providers for some of the other things that they're responsible for. Lastly, we're still seeing roughly 16% of things on-prem that, again, are quote-unquote falling under this critical application list. I thought that was a little surprising as well. Some additional observations. We have a lot of applications that are customer-facing, externally facing, which provides opportunities for bad actors. And I see that number growing year over year. So, we're becoming more connected. We're allowing more access to customers, and externally, kind of D all the above. But as far as the most prevalent critical business apps that you'll see there on the bottom, things like AWS is a little interesting because, well, AWS is not a critical business app. It's an infrastructure. It's a service. It's an organization that provides these things to you. But organizations don't point to the critical business app within AWS. They point to AWS. There could be a whole string of conversations there. But lastly, you also look at applications like Slack, where originally we used it as an instant messaging tool. Well, now it's hard to think of what Slack can't do and how organizations are or are not using it. We often find that we start talking about Slack when we go through this exercise, especially the sensitive data inventory, and everybody is storing everything within Slack. And then the security team does the rubberneck where they, jerk their head over because they had no idea that the, things were being stored there. As far as the sensitive data inventory, this goes back to one of the first slides. Nothing very interesting here as far as data types or the percentages, but it just goes to show that as we're assessing these environments, it really doesn't matter about the data type itself. Data is everywhere, and there's lots of it. So when we go to organizations, often it's we're talking about, all right, where are the crown jewels? Where would a attacker target? And we might see a bunch of customer data in these 5 applications, intellectual property in these 2. Again, data is everywhere. So one of the exercises that we do as part of this is, we look at attack vectors and threat actors, as I mentioned, but we compare those 2 and figure out what are probably the more likely scenarios that you might see within the organizations, So if we start with threat actors, by far the most common actors that we see are user error, malicious insider, which is not too shocking because, well, things like user error, malicious insider get quickly reported. They're in change control. We can pull evidence and data that, those are very easy to identify. Whereas if we look at the least prevalent actors, we see things like nation states, which makes you scratch your head considering China is, scratching the surface, knocking on doors for everyone. What we're seeing is that organizations just don't know that nation states are inside their network, right? We've done some forensics work, and oftentimes you'll say, "Hey, organization, did you know data is being sent out to Ukraine or Russia or China or whoever it is?" And they had no idea. So the number here may be skewed, but it's an interesting data point. If we look at the attack vectors, it's a kind of even spread against vectors. I mean, we see privilege misuse, software misconfiguration, as you guys can see here. Not shocking at all. There is a variety of ways in which we see something happening at organizations. If we look at the least prevalent, physical loss theft, well, not too shocking, right? Everything's going on the cloud, so I expect that number to keep going down. But things like malicious software and unpatched systems, I don't know. I think those are lower than they should be. I think they get lumped into certain scenarios, but it is what it is. So if we combine the two, the threat actors and attack vectors, we start to paint a picture of what could be our highest potential threat actors, attack vectors, the threat scenario, right? So again, a lot of user error, malicious insider, but the combinations there, it's user error with privilege misuse. So we're seeing, well, administrators do silly things, or user error with software misconfiguration. Again, either something got changed, like the S3 bucket that's now public, even though you had to click on the button and go through the big bright red screen, somehow it was still misconfigured, right? Things like that. So if we go to the third bubble, the controls assessment, we're seeing some very interesting trends here. So as part of the controls assessment, we poll executives and we just ask them two simple questions. Overall, and based on the maturity scale, where do you think you are today as an organization, and where do you think you need to be? From control owners, we go through the entire, in this case, we're using the NIST CSF. We go through the entire framework, we figure out each control, so we have a much more accurate current and future state. But if we start to plot these together, you notice some interesting items. First of all, the control owner range on where they are today versus where they think they need to be is substantial. 1.61 on the maturity scale of 0 to 5 it means there's a lot of work to be done, right? We see that owners are trying to be aggressive, and this is what we need to do, but the amount of work here again is substantial. Usually when we joke around when we're talking about the differences in scores, a quarter point means you're really close. Half point in general means that you have some decent work to do. But let's say that NCC Group and the control owner disagreed on a scale it's a full point. That means that what you're thinking and what you're doing is not aligned. So again, lots of work to be done there. If we look at executives, they're actually a bit more consistent, even though there is some progress shown. Interesting that they say we think we're at a 3, we need to go to a 4, but if you look at the requirements for a 4, a 4 is very aggressive. As a baseline here, if we look at things like SOC 2 assessments, CPA firm will go in and they'll test for operating effectiveness. On average, you're heading towards a 4. But it, in reality is probably closer to 3.75. So, executives aren't too far off, but what is concerning is the difference between what we're seeing with current state on control owners versus the current state of executives. Again, a significant gap there. There's a major difference between, a 1.76 and a 3.15. 1.76 to me suggests that you still have major programs, processes, or controls that need to be fleshed out, defined, let alone documented. Whereas if you look at a 3.15 from the executives, they're saying that everything has been defined, it's been buttoned up, it's documented, it is a fully defined control. So definitely a gap there. Again, from the NIST CSF standpoint, which is, like I said, probably 80% of the assessments we do, I thought it was interesting the control areas that we have that score the lowest on average and the highest. If we look at the lowest, we see things like data leakage, integrity checking. These all make sense to me. We go in, we ask for it, it's just plain not there. But if we go to some of the higher scoring areas, things like supply chain risk management, I scratched my head a little bit there because, if we look in the news, a lot of times things like third parties, think of the Target breach and quite a few others, third parties seem to be the major source of risk to organizations. So what I'm hearing here is that organizations have a sound third-party risk management or supply chain risk management function. It just may not be operating as efficiently and effectively as it could. The second one here, access control, we look at some of the threat actors, attack vectors. Again, we see that user error and malicious insider combined with excessive privileges are some of the top threats to organizations. So again, it's telling me that we have sound controls, sound processes, but they're not operating as intended occasionally. So if we go into the full set of numbers here, right? Again, I'm using the CSF. This is the picture that we're painting, throughout the entire thing. On average, organizations are somewhere between a 1.76. They're going towards a 3.37, and you see the benchmark maturity that's right smack dab in the middle there. So interesting observations I see here. The current state from the client and the current state from NCC Group are typically very close. Yes, we do coach organizations when we go through and do the scoring, but really that score is up to the organization. We do have the option to provide our score, which occasionally differs. So for example, if the organization says they're at a 3 for this control, we didn't receive documentation, well, that's pretty easy. But largely we are aligned. But if you look at current versus future, the target maturity for most organizations is way past even the benchmark maturity for what their peers are doing. Not that that's a bad thing, but it just kind of shows that everyone is somewhere between where they want to be and somewhere where their peers are, but there's always work to be done. So I know I quickly went through this, but if I were to summarize some of the major things that we're seeing as part of these assessments, we have to align security and business goals. There's a lot of times that we'll provide a report, we'll present it to the CEO, the board, whoever it is, and if the security team hasn't been able to align those business goals, sometimes that report goes into the trash, right? So if you can't tie the business, then you're not going to get their support. Likewise, it's concerning that the board is saying that they're much more comfortable with risks to the organization, that it is a top worry, but as the numbers that I'm showing there are suggesting, it's maybe we're not painting the full picture. So we highly recommend that, of course, we need to provide a much better picture to the executives so that the fears that they're having are aligned with what is reality. Focus on core cybersecurity programs and aspects. This goes back to some of the numbers that I was showing there. Okay, it's one thing to have a sound third-party risk management program, but if you're not operating as intended, or if it's not operating very well, what's the point? We see a lot of organizations that they're focusing on the new, bigger, better thing, but some of the basic blocking and tackling, things like change control, app dev, patch management, have holes in them. So until those are robust and you're able to, not worry about those because they are sound programs, it's probably better to focus on those rather than future aspects. Relevant threats, like I said, most organizations don't go through and actually analyze the threats to their organization. We've found that, by going through the exercise, you can focus on what you need to focus on rather than focusing on everything. Often some of the threats that we've documented are kind of night and day. We see some that are major focus areas, things that, yes, we've seen this at the organization, whereas some of them that's not an impact to me. So again, it's a prioritization method there. Focus on reducing data. As we've shown, data is everywhere and it's very prevalent, and all types of data are kind of in that bucket. There's a quote from one of my coworkers that essentially says, you can't effectively or efficiently protect data or assets to the organization without isolating it, segmenting it, and focusing on certain areas, right? It's not practical to protect the entire environment. Resourcing needs. Yes, most organizations are funding their security teams. We find that headcount is kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes they have less staff than they need, but oftentimes it's they've been treated in one way, and it's that steady state environment as opposed to what the organization is doing, where they're transforming, new things are occurring, new technologies are going from on-prem to cloud, haven't been considered when resourcing security. And then lastly, privacy. We don't traditionally cover privacy under the cybersecurity review. We have, but for some reason, privacy comes up as part of every engagement. And what we're seeing is that privacy is treated as something separate from security, whereas, as we know, security drives privacy. So, don't forget about that. Now, let me pause here. Apologies, I talked very quickly and I went through a lot of detail. I know that some of the data here is very general, especially to your individual organizations. But I'd like to offer, maybe I can work with you guys at some point, spend 30 minutes, go through a workshop so that we can tailor what I went through here to be something a little more specific to your organization, right? We do this for large organizations, we do it for small, some are more mature than others. We cover every industry vertical. So let me pause there for any questions, that anyone may have, and we can go from there.
Great, Chris. I do see a question that came in somewhat through your presentation about, is it 2 to 5% of the IT budget? I'm not sure, Devin, if you want to unmute and clarify.
Yeah, so you were talking about just IT security budget as a percent of the budget, but you didn't qualify whether that was overall budget or the IT spend. I'm assuming it's the IT spend.
Correct, yeah. In most of those organizations, that's security reporting through IT, so it's 2% of the IT spend.
Okay, thanks.
I don't see any other questions. If anyone else has questions, please feel free to unmute or type them into the chat box, and Chris can address.
Yes, I'm sorry. This is Bruce. I have a question about the last comment about the security and the IT budget. Don't you feel that nowadays, and I think it's been happening for several years now, is that security is now somewhat separate than IT? So the security departments are becoming part of C teams. So there are chief security officers. And as we all know, they run lateral with IT, because sometimes when IT will run security, it affects the initiatives, solutions, and things of that nature. And having them at an equal level, I think, gives a company better leverage. What do you feel about that?
Absolutely agree. I've heard comments at organizations where, oh, well, that will make them, like internal audit, where you don't trust them, or they're the enemy, right? But I completely agree with you. I mean, they should be at the same level, working together. I think the operational concern that I highlighted and that we're seeing in many organizations is not malicious in nature. It's going back to the business goals. Hey, we've got to get this out so that the business can sell this new widget, and ultimately security suffers. And I don't know. I think if they're separate, it's a different consideration. Then that person who has to balance the business versus security doesn't have to make that decision.
Good, thank you.
Good question.
Anyone else? Any other questions for Chris? All right, I think we're good. If you guys think of any other questions, please feel free to send them over to your rep at ADS or at Atlantic, sorry. Or you can send them over my way and I can filter them to the right person or get them over to Chris to get them answered for you.